Taoiseach, the student accommodation crisis has become something of a permanent issue for third-level students who are trying to access third-level education in this state. The Union of Students of Ireland said that it is the worst it has ever been. Galway students are sleeping in tents and are protesting not just at the deficit in accommodation, but at the absolute absence of student accommodation in this state. Indeed, last September, representatives from USI were outside the gates of this very House, protesting at the fact that thousands of students had been left without a place to live at the start of the new academic year. At the beginning of this September, the chaplain of the new Technological University of the Shannon said that he understood that the number of beds available to students in Athlone this year has fallen by 500 because of the unprecedented number of international protection applicants that have been housed in this region. Perhaps the kindest thing that we can say about all of this is that it is an omni-shambles that has been made worse and prolonged as a direct result of government policy and the failure to act quickly enough when it became clear that both the private and institutional on-campus accommodation was being gobbled up to meet the demands of what the Housing Minister has described as our international obligations. But I want to focus on another element of this crisis, Taoiseach, and that is that the very real danger that we're now confronted with in respect of access to third level becoming once again the preserve of the wealthy and those fortunate enough to have very high incomes, and that's what's happening. With rents now routinely approaching €1,000 per month, it is next to impossible for the majority of students to afford this without either incurring substantial debt or deferring indefinitely. Even those on the highest rate of SUSI grants cannot afford such rates. This is not only tragic, but it is absolutely ironic, given that it was the admirable actions of statesmen like Donogh O'Malley who was instrumental in opening up our education system to those who were excluded because of lack of means. Over 50 years ago, and under one Fianna Fáil minister, access to education became a right. Under the current Fianna Fáil Housing Minister, and indeed your own government, it may yet regress to become a privilege. It doesn't make any difference if this is not your intention, Taoiseach, but it is the result of government's policies which are plain to see. I accept the reduction in costs that Minister Harris has secured in the budget, but all of those benefits will remain purely theoretical, or I might even say academic, if getting to college goes the same way as home ownership, more generally a fading dream for an entire generation. Taoiseach, will you commit to re-establishing the Education Disadvantage Committee, who did great work and who can become a forum to tackle this very issue and tackle the barriers to third-level education?
Well, first of all, I would say that the situation is very challenging in respect of student accommodation, and it's reflective of the wider issues in terms of housing supply and new construction, and also viability issues in terms of land that universities own, but are not in a position to develop with developers on the basis of what they believe is a viability gap between the cost of that student accommodation if it was to be built and what students could realistically be prepared to pay. And so the Minister has met with the presidents and chairs of all the traditional universities and the technological universities to discuss any immediate proposals they may have identified for additional student accommodation provision in the short to medium terms, and the Department is continuing to work with them in that regard. That said, University of Galway were in a position this academic year to provide an additional 670 new bed spaces, which won't come on stream immediately but will come on stream later this year. So there is an issue in the viability in terms of the cost of building, which is somewhat similar to what we had to do with Croí Cónaithe. We introduced Croí Cónaithe to deal with the viability gap in built-up dense areas of inner cities, in brownfield sites. The market is saying it can't build them for affordable prices, and the state has had to intervene to try and bridge that viability gap. And the same is applied in respect of student accommodation, and we are looking at mechanisms to see how we can do that. In the meantime, I would make the point that successive Fianna Fáil ministers, including myself in the late 90s and early 2000s, took measures that have resulted in very high participation rates in third level education in Ireland. One of the highest in Europe. Ireland enjoys one of the highest participation rates in third level education. That said, accommodation is the big problem, and I would accept that, and the cost of accommodation is the big problem for students. Now, this year, Minister Harris, with Minister McGrath in the budget, brought in a range of measures to support students, not least reduction of fees by 1,000, the SUSI grant, 17.4 million once-off extra payment equivalent to 1 month's maintenance for all student maintenance grants recipients. That will be made by this December to students. Once-off increase of €1,000 to support postgraduate students who meet the eligibility criteria for a postgraduate fee contribution grant, and that goes up to 4,500 for those. 8 million for the Student Assistance Fund, and a once-off payment in 2022 of €500 for PhD students who receive an IRC or SFI award. And there's a whole range of other measures also to offer relief to students in 23-24 that the Minister has taken in respect of that, in trying to make things that bit more manageable for students during what is a very difficult period with the energy situation. We've brought in the rent credit as well, of 1,000, which will be a value of €1,000 to renters in respect of 500 in 2023 and 500 in 2022. And student accommodation is capped under the rent pressure zones.
Taoiseach, I did acknowledge the measures that were brought in to alleviate the pressures. However, it's not enough. This crisis has been years in the making. We have all met USI representatives. We've all met college and university representatives who've told us about this, and who've told us quite clearly that this crisis would become worse. But I would like to know if you will answer the question in terms of this is a real barrier for students now, and it will deter many, many students from going to college. And unfortunately, college and third level education will become a preserve of the wealthy if action isn't taken on this issue. So I would ask you, will your government reinstate the Education Disadvantage Committee to try and have a focus on this and deal quickly with this issue? And also, Minister Taoiseach, your Minister, Minister Dara O'Brien, you know, he's talking about meeting international obligations, but he needs to be also focused on meeting the needs of our student population. We have tens of thousands of students without accommodation, and that's a reality. Unfortunately, that's the fact of the matter. I'm getting calls every day of the week from students all over the country who cannot source accommodation.
I think when Minister O'Brien talks about international obligations, he's talking about the need for the Minister for Children, for example, to procure a lot of hotel space and rooms and accommodation to account for those fleeing war. I don't think we should juxtapose people fleeing a terrible war with the student accommodation crisis. Many students would support the government's approach in supporting refugees who are fleeing a terrible war. And I would say that we need analysis. I don't believe it will allow or facilitate third level becoming the preserve of the rich. But I do accept that we need to take urgent measures, and it will take time to get new blocks built, but to bridge that viability gap between what universities say they can realistically construct purpose-built specific student accommodation and what they could subsequently then rent it out to students at an affordable price. At the moment, that gap is far too wide. Again, now they're asking the state to intervene to try and bridge that gap. The state is becoming, if you like, the house provider of last resort in a lot of situations in the current market. That is the housing situation.
Thank you,
but we are looking at that very seriously.